The first time they dumped rotting yard waste over my fence, I thought it was a mistake. The third time, I knew it was a message. By the time I found my wife's memorial garden buried under chemical-soaked grass, I understood exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. My name is Owen Mercer, and for 22 years I worked as an environmental investigator for Tennessee, testing soil, tracing runoff, and telling powerful people things they did not want to hear. I retired after my wife Hannah was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and 7 months later I was standing alone in a house outside Knoxville, wondering how a person kept living when the voice that made the place feel like home was gone. Hannah had spent her final good years restoring 5 acres into a native meadow, milkweed, asters, goldenrod, and switchgrass, all planted by hand in stubborn red clay. After she died, keeping that meadow alive became the closest thing I had to keeping a promise. Then Pine Hollow Estates expanded along my eastern property line. Matching mailboxes, perfect lawns, and a 6-foot fence separating their version of nature from mine. Their HOA president was Marlene Voss, a woman who wore white linen jackets to meetings and spoke to adults like they were late on homework. She had run the neighborhood for 8 years, nobody challenged her, and her husband Curtis happened to own the landscaping company paid to maintain every lawn in Pine Hollow. The first pile appeared in April, leaves and hedge trimmings pushed through a loose section of fence, so I cleaned it up and assumed some worker had cut a corner. A week later there were 2 piles, then 4, then a wet mound dumped directly over the milkweed Hannah planted during her last spring. I went to the clubhouse and found Marlene beside the pool, sipping iced tea while Curtis stood behind her with his arms folded. I told her their crew had been dumping waste onto my land. She looked over her sunglasses and said, "It is biodegradable," Mr. Sunglasses said. "Mercer, you should thank us for the free mulch." I told her it was covering a memorial garden. She glanced toward my property and smiled without warmth. "That field looks abandoned, not memorialized." Curtis laughed, and something inside me went very still. I had spent years dealing with companies that hid contamination behind polished reports, and I knew people like Marlene counted on everyone else being too tired to push back. The next morning, I sent the HOA a certified letter with dates, photographs, and a demand that the dumping stop. 2 weeks later, Marlene answered, not with an apology, but with a complaint accusing my property of lowering home values. 3 days after that, a county officer walked the meadow with me, shook his head, and said there was no violation. Before leaving, he paused beside his truck and said, "You are the 5th person she has reported this year, and every complaint was dismissed." That was when I stopped seeing Marlene as an irritated neighbor and started seeing a pattern. That night, I opened my laptop, created a folder called Pine Hollow, and began saving everything, every letter, photograph, date, and name. I did not know yet that the waste contained something far more dangerous than grass clippings, or that the money behind it would lead straight back to Marlene and Curtis. All I knew was that they thought I was a grieving old man with no fight left in him, and they were about to learn how wrong they were. I spent the next week doing what I had done for most of my career, watching quietly while people assumed I was doing nothing. I bought 3 motion-activated trail cameras and mounted them along the fence line, one on an oak tree, one behind an old water trough, and one low enough to catch license plates. 2 mornings later, a green landscaping truck backed toward the loose boards at 5018 Amen. The tailgate dropped, and wet grass slid onto my property. The logo belonged to Voss Outdoor Services, and in the next clip Curtis stepped out, looked both ways, and shoveled the pile farther into Hannah's meadow. At the next HOA meeting, I showed Marlene the footage in front of 20 homeowners. She barely looked at it. "Those workers acted without authorization," she said. "Make a note and move on." Her husband was on camera, but she delivered the lie like she was reading the weather. I did not argue, because people like Marlene rarely stop after one lie, and every extra lie makes the truth easier to prove. In the parking lot, an older resident named Frank Delaney said he had seen Curtis's trucks near my fence for months. He warned me that Marlene had a habit of making anyone who questioned her look unstable. He was right. Within days, an online petition called my meadow a neglected eyesore, using photographs of the waste piles as proof, carefully framed so nobody could see where they came from. Then Marlene asked the county to rezone my land so I would be forced to meet the HOA's landscaping standards. The request failed, but the message was clear. She wanted me to regret speaking. A week later, I found the south edge of the meadow dead. Not dry, not damaged. Dead. A strip nearly 40 feet long had turned yellow and brown overnight, and the milkweed Hannah planted during her final spring came out with roots soft as wet string. I knew the smell immediately. Sharp, metallic, chemical. Someone had sprayed along the fence from the Pine Hollow side. I stood there holding one dead stem and remembered Hannah kneeling in that same spot, laughing because she could not get back up without my help. She had looked at the tiny plants and said, "They will come back stronger next year." For the first time, I wanted to walk straight to Marlene's house and forget every calm thing I had ever learned. Instead, I took soil samples, photographed the damage, measured the spray pattern, and called Frank to witness it. 10 days later, a university lab confirmed the soil contained a restricted commercial pesticide at concentrations unsafe for residential use. That result changed everything. The clippings were not just unwanted waste, they were contaminated material. I requested 4 years of HOA financial records. Marlene delayed, claimed the files were under audit, then blamed a software change. When I cited state law and copied the Attorney General's consumer office, 2 heavy boxes appeared on my porch. I spent 3 nights at the kitchen table going through every invoice. Pine Hollow residents had been charged thousands each month for hauling and commercial disposal, but there were no landfill receipts, no transfer station records, no proof that a single load had ever been legally processed. They had been paying Curtis to drive the waste 200 yards and dump it over my fence. Then I found unexplained payments approved by Marlene, inflated labor charges, and money moving through accounts with no second signature. I hired a forensic accountant named Daniel Reed, and while he followed the money, I followed the water. My property sat uphill from Pine Hollow's retention pond, the same pond connected to the neighborhood irrigation system. Every hard rain washed runoff from the dump zone downhill into that pond. Then the sprinklers pumped it back across every lawn. I collected samples from the inlet, center, and outlet. All 3 tested positive. 136 families had been watering their yards with contaminated water, and Marlene's cost-cutting scheme had created a poison loop around her own neighborhood. Curtis came to my property 2 days later and told me to stop digging into matters that were none of my business. I looked at him and said, "You put it on my land, Curtis. That made it my business." He left without another word. That evening, Daniel called and said the missing money was worse than we thought, and the state environmental investigator wanted to attend Pine Hollow's annual meeting. Marlene had announced it as a night of community unity. She had no idea I was coming with video, lab reports, bank records, and the one map that would make every homeowner in that room realize the danger had been under their feet all along. The annual meeting started at 7 on a Thursday night, and Marlene had packed the clubhouse with more than 100 homeowners by promising a vote to protect Pine Hollow from outside interference. I arrived 12 minutes late on purpose, not because I wanted attention, but because the people walking in behind me needed the whole room to see them. First came Elena Brooks from the State Environmental Division, then a county investigator, Daniel Reed, carrying his forensic report, and finally a local television reporter with a camera already recording. Marlene stopped halfway through a sentence about community values. Her hands tightened around the podium as every chair in the room turned toward us. "This is a private meeting," she said. "The press is not welcome." Frank stood from the second row and reminded her that homeowners had the right to invite guests. Then another board member seconded a motion to give me the floor. Marlene tried to object, but for the first time in 8 years, people talked over her. I connected my laptop to the projector and started with the trail camera footage. Curtis's truck appeared on the screen at 5,018 in the morning. Then Curtis himself stepped into view and pushed contaminated waste through my fence. Nobody spoke. I showed the laboratory report next, then the financial records. 4 years of disposal charges with no landfill receipts, inflated invoices, inflated bin invoices, unexplained payments, and more than $180,000 that Daniel could not account for. Marlene laughed once, a small nervous sound, and called it a misunderstanding. Then I put the drainage map on the screen. A blue line traced the runoff from my property into Pine Hollow's retention pond, and from there into the irrigation system connected to every street. The waste dumped on my land contained a restricted pesticide, I told them. Rain carried it into your pond, and your sprinklers carried it back onto your lawns. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Someone asked about children playing barefoot. Another man shouted that his dog had been sick for months. Elena stood and announced that the state had opened the formal contamination investigation. Curtis's company had been issued an immediate stop order and the pond would have to be closed. That was when the room broke apart. People who had signed Marlene's petition were suddenly demanding bank statements. One homeowner waved his phone and asked why she had called me a liar. Marlene grabbed her purse and moved toward the side door, but Frank stepped to the microphone and called for a vote of no confidence. 91 people voted to remove her, 5 voted against it, and the rest were too stunned to raise their hands. Marlene walked up beneath the red light of the news camera, with Curtis following several steps behind her. Within 2 months, his landscaping license was revoked. Both of them were charged in connection with the dumping and missing funds, and they sold their house before the first court hearing. Pine Hollow paid dearly for the cleanup, which some people said was unfair because most homeowners had trusted the board rather than participated in the fraud. Maybe they were right, but trust without questions can become permission. My settlement paid to restore Hannah's meadow. I replanted every dead section, added a gravel path, and placed a wooden bench where she used to watch the butterflies. The next spring, Frank brought me a milkweed plant, and 3 Pine Hollow families asked for seeds. I still do not know whether that neighborhood learned the right lesson, because some residents blamed Marlene, while others blamed me for exposing damage they could no longer ignore. So tell me what you think. Was I right to reveal everything knowing innocent families would pay for the cleanup? Or should I have handled it quietly and spared the community? Leave your answer in the comments, share this story with someone who has dealt with an abusive HOA, and subscribe, because sometimes the quietest person at the meeting is the one carrying the evidence that changes everything.